Welcome to our second episode of Dying to Get Well with mother-daughter team Michelle and Alyssa.
Hi.
Today, I will be telling you my story of growing up in Riverside, California, with a father who was addicted to meth and multiple family members who were addicted to meth as well. Also, I will be telling about getting married at a young age to an abusive husband, divorce, eviction, all the fun things. I'm also going to talk a little bit about finding out that my oldest daughter, Alyssa, who is also my co-host, had a addiction problem and a substance use disorder problem, and also taking guardianship of my granddaughter, Zoe. Okay, so now a little bit of my background and my story. Well, I was born in Riverside, California, and those of you who don't know, Riverside is or was, I'm not sure that it still is, but it was the meth capital of the world, basically. So there was definitely...
They were talking about filming Breaking Bad in Riverside, California, before they ended up changing it to Albuquerque, New Mexico. They were going to film it in Riverside.
I wonder why that is. I'm just kidding. So it is true what you hear about Riverside to a certain degree, for sure. I also heard that Riverside would have been bankrupt had there not been a lot of drugs and they hadn't taken the police hadn't confiscated a lot of money from the drug dealers. Right. Riverside would have gone bankrupt. So I guess that helped us out a little bit in that respect. But anyways, being raised in Riverside was interesting. I have a great mother, and she married my dad at a young age, and he was first an alcoholic, which was really scary. When I was a young girl, he used to get really crazy, drunk, and abusive. He was a very big guy, 6'3". My mom was tiny, 5'6". She was about 100 pounds, maybe. My dad was about 250, and he just looked like a mountain. Like if you ever seen Grizzly Adams, that's what he looked like.
Yeah, he's a big guy.
But later in life, he looked like Santa Claus, so he wasn't quite as scary anymore.
I never knew the scary grandpa.
Yeah,
I only ever knew the one that calmed way down once he got old.
People mellow out in their old age. Like he used to love, we'd be driving down the street and kids would be pointing at him. I'd be like, what are they pointing in the car for, Dad? And he'd be like, oh girl, they think I'm Santa. And he'd be waving to them and saying ho ho ho, and he loved that.
Yeah.
But he was also a very scary guy. My dad had two sides to him. It was either a grizzly bear or a teddy bear, so
he went through a lot.
He grew up in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And my grandpa was he used to pick cotton out there in Fort Smith. And they were very poor. And they had 8 children. So out of the 8 children, 5 of them, was it 5? Yeah, 5 of them, let me see. 6 of them survived and moved to California with my grandparents. 5 of them became addicted to methamphetamines. My uncle David went to, I believe it was Vietnam, and I believe that when he came back, he wasn't quite right, and he started using, and then all of the brothers started using, and then my aunt started using later, I think.
And how many of them are left?
1.
Yeah.
1. A lot of... And
they weren't that old, none of them.
No, there was so much things that happened. I had... one uncle hung himself in a park in Riverside, and that was at Meyerland Park. And then I had another uncle who shot himself in his shop out in Hemet.
In front of Grandpa?
Well, my dad was in the other room.
Well, my dad came out.
Yeah, he came out. He's the one who found him.
That messed him up a lot. He changed a lot after that. I remember him acting a lot different than he used to after that.
Oh, that's a lot to see, I imagine. Mm-hmm. And then...
that was his closest brother, wasn't it? He was living with him for a long time, had a business with him.
Yeah, I mean, he was close to all his brothers, but it was they would fight off and on. He'd be coming down off drugs, and they would fight over drugs, and they would fight over things. I had an uncle who had a shop, and he did air conditioning, and he and I think my older uncle, the older brother, decided to make it into a meth lab. So it very much was like Breaking Bad. So when I first saw Breaking Bad, I laughed, because they changed the shop into a meth lab. And back then it was an air conditioning shop. So back then they sold some kind of Freon that you could use to make meth. I think it was R something. They don't sell it anymore. But anyway, so they were making some money. They were selling to Hell's Angels and stuff like that.
And then they got in trouble with them, right?
Then the SWAT team came.
my gosh.
So the SWAT team came and, raided the shop. And, that kind of ended that. And that uncle, he didn't pass away from drugs. I think it was something else. It was more like cancer, but I think he did have a drug addiction problem, substance use disorder problem all the way.
Like a lot of people in
up
the family,
until he
right?
passed. It was just unreal in my family. I even had cousins who had problems with drugs. And they, one that stayed with us, a female cousin that stayed with us.
And so do I, all on your side.
Right? I had a female cousin that stayed with us. And then I had a male cousin that put a sawed-off shotgun in his mouth at the age of 29 after doing a lot of shrooms. He didn't really have he wasn't doing meth and all that stuff all those years, but he did some shrooms and some other drugs that made him not quite right in the head. And so that was devastating because he and I were very close. So that was really the worst for me, like when that happened. So I seen a lot of that growing up, but first started with alcohol with my dad. He was an alcoholic and he was a mean drunk, and he would just when I say tear things up, I mean, he would come in the house. We would be asleep at night. We were just little kids, and he would come in and start yelling and screaming at our mom and start just breaking stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he would break all the dishes. One time he went outside and threw them out in the street, like all my mom's dishes. One time he broke the coffee table in half. Another time he walked through the door, like the door was like a thin door. He literally just walked through it. So we just would come out. Sometimes we would just be in our room crying. We would try to go out. We didn't come out, but we would try to come out. But our brother Jody, he would gather us all up on one bed and try to protect us and tell us it was going to be all right. And we would be begging our dad from the door, way to stop and, and please stop. And usually he didn't get physical with our mom, but once in a while he would. And the next day, our dad would be all calm and in bed, and he would call to us and be like, come on kids, come get in bed with your daddy. Don't you love your daddy? I'm sorry. And my mom would be up under his arm, and we would go in there and we would all hug and cuddle, and he would tickle us. But eventually, after a while, my brother Jody would not come anymore.
Well, now why do you think Grandma, your mom, put up with that?
My mom was raised by her mom and dad, and her mother worked a lot. The dad was kind of did odd jobs and stuff, and so he was home most of the time, and her mom was at work, and she worked really hard. She did she worked at several places, but I remember my mom telling me that she used to iron clothes and work in a place where there was all this steam, almost like a factory ironing people's clothes.
How old was she? Do you remember?
My mom or
at the time when she was working these jobs?
Oh, my mom wasn't doing that. My grandma was.
Oh, I see.
My grandma used to have to work to support the 5 kids. There were 5 kids, and they were
a long time ago.
Yeah, they were in Kansas. My dad grew up in Arkansas. My mom grew up in Kansas, and they met in Bloomington, California. So it's you just never know what's going to happen. But
right.
My mom, I think, put up with my dad because my mom was molested by her dad. Oh. So she was molested by her dad
at a young age, right?
All her life is what she says. Yeah. I mean, I don't know what that means.
She didn't talk about him with me. She did not. When I asked her when I was younger, I remember I was a teenager and I asked her about her parents, and she did not want to talk about her dad.
No, my mom never dealt with it in a way that she could really process it, I think.
Yeah.
But who can force someone to process anything like that? I mean, what can you do? I mean, I would never try to force her to remember that or to talk about it, but she did talk to me about it off and on throughout my life.
Do you think her mom knew?
Oh, I don't know about all that. I mean, I don't want to get into that end of it. I think that at one point, right before her dad killed himself, my grandmother found out and she wasn't with him anymore.
He killed himself?
He shot himself when my mom was 16.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and she said at the funeral, she looked at his hands in the coffin, and all she could think about was that he can never touch me again. And hearing my mom say that, I was young when she told me that story, and that really affected me at a young age, realizing how awful that must have been for her, and how much it must have really affected her. The only thing at your dad's funeral you could think about is that he can't touch you again, and that's just really sad. And,
right.
And she didn't ever want girls. She told me that. She actually didn't want kids, but she definitely didn't want girls. She told us that a lot. Like, I never wanted girls. And then we would say, Daddy, what did you want? And he would say elephants. Like, he was just like lighthearted, you know, he was kind of trying to make it lighthearted. But I think for her, it was scary. And it is scary to have a girl. I remember when I had you, I was like, oh my God, I have to protect her. Oh my God, somebody might touch her. Oh my God. I mean, you have this weird, sometimes you have this weird, overwhelming anxiety about it because the world is such an evil place. And when you've seen as much as you've seen, you know, it's hard. And my mom, a sad part, when my mom was at the hospital, this is gonna be hard to talk about. When she was at the hospital and I went with her right before she passed away, right before she got put on hospice, I went to her house. And it was during COVID, and I was working remotely from her house. And I was like, Mom, I have to get online for my Zoom meeting. And she was like, okay, you know. And I said, you want me to make you some breakfast first? And she said, no, I'm fine. And she went and laid down. Well, I hadn't been there for a few days. And she went and laid down on the couch. And she was like, all day I was just working. And then her hospice nurse came in and she said, you know, she felt her and she's like, Margie, you have a temperature. And she took her temperature and she had a high temperature. And she said, how do you feel on a scale of 1 to 10? And she said, I feel awful. I feel like an 8. And I'm like, Mom, you're sick. And she was just that person. She would not take care of everybody else. Right. Never hardly take care of herself. Yeah. You know, and she just always wanted to take care of the kids and make sure we were safe. But she didn't want to be a burden to anyone. Right. So it was really disturbing to me. And I had to force her to go to the hospital that day. So we get to the hospital and they're saying they have to life flight her out to Phoenix because they can't help her. She's having pancreas problems from the immunotherapy. So they have to flight her. She had lung cancer. Yeah. So she was doing immunotherapy because the chemo was too hard on her body. You know, she was 70. She smoked since she was 13. And she quit the last year. She quit a year. And then she also had the lobectomy, which did not help. It made it worse. And then she had to get on pain meds, you know, and she hated taking anything. She started smoking young, too. Her and Grandpa, right? Yeah, her and my dad did. I mean, that was kind of a thing back then. A lot of people gave it up, you know, later in life when they realized. But some people just couldn't get away from it. Right. It was like a stress reliever for her. I get that. Right. But then we went to the hospital, and we're sitting in the hospital room. And I don't know how it came up, but she starts talking about her dad. Oh, wow. And I was that must have been a shock. I was kind of shocked, you know, because here she is really sick. And she's just telling me stuff. And, oh, my God, I have to admit, it broke my heart. Yeah. I mean, she's telling me, like, one time my dad took us to some place. It was like a little place where there was water or something. And the siblings were with her. And they went back to the car. They all went back to the car. And he's like, well, me and Margie need to go over here and do something. And she said she was so embarrassed because he was molesting her. And her siblings were waiting at the car. And she said she felt like they knew or that, like, she just felt dirty. Yeah. You know, and how bad that made her feel. Yeah. And she talked about an uncle who was her favorite uncle, and he came to visit one time, and he picked her up and put her on his back or his shoulders, and he started touching her. Oh my God. She's called it messing with me. She said then he started messing with me, and her brother was there, and she said, put me down. And he just kept holding her up there, and he had to yell at him and tell him, put her down. She told you to put her down. And the brother had to yell at him because the brother had a bad vibe, you know? Yeah. So, I mean, it was really heartbreaking. I also seen Maya Angelou once. She's one of my favorites people, you know, on the planet. And I went to see her at UCR, and she was in her 80s. Didn't I tell you about that? You're the happening? You're the one who told me. I saw it, and I was like, oh my gosh, Mom, you're a person. I was hoping you'd go with me, but you didn't give a crap to go. So that was sad to me. But I went by myself. I was the crazy white lady in the back crying when Maya Angelou was singing, and I love her. I adore her. She's so great with her poetry and her story. But she was telling her story about being raped as a little girl, and, you know, she started crying. She was in her 80s. Right. And it just doesn't go away. It doesn't go away. Right. It just doesn't. This trauma. Right. You know, I know that she has I think it's a poem that says, I wouldn't take anything from my journey now. So she wouldn't change what she's been through. Mm-hmm. I get that. I understand, because trauma can mold us and shape us and help us to be the people that we are and be able to help others. Right. But it's still very sad to see. So when my mom was there at the hospital talking about that, it was really heartbreaking for me. Yeah. But yeah, that's kind of a little background on her and her story and how she kind of became codependent you know, and she kind of felt like she was stuck. She said, though, at one point when my dad asked her to marry him, she told him no. Like, she decided she didn't want to marry him like 2 weeks later, and he went into like a field and was crying, and she felt sorry for him, so she married him.
Oh my gosh.
But I can tell you what, my